The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Catherine stood in the grand hallway, her fingers nervously adjusting the pearl necklace that had been a wedding gift from Queen Elizabeth. The weight of the day ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders, and she could feel her heart racing despite her calm exterior. William emerged from his study, his face bearing the same composed expression he wore during official engagements. But Catherine knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. They had been married for over a decade, weathered countless storms together, but today felt different. Today would test the very foundation of their partnership. The palace corridors buzzed with quiet activity as staff members prepared for what everyone knew would be a significant day. Footsteps echoed against the walls, punctuated by hushed conversations and the rustle of formal documents. Catherine watched William check his phone for the third time in 5 minutes, his brow furrowing as he read something on the screen. "Car will be here in 20 minutes, he said softly, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. The distance between them felt like an ocean, even though they stood only a few feet apart. Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. She thought back to their early days at university, when they were just Kate Middleton and Prince William, two young people falling in love without the weight of the crown. Between them, those carefree moments seemed like a lifetime ago now. The pressures of royal life, the constant scrutiny, and the demands of duty had slowly chipped away at the simple joy they once shared. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Private Secretary Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression professional, but sympathetic. "Royal Highnesses, the arrangements are complete. The statement has been prepared for release this afternoon." Catherine felt her stomach drop. The statement that would change everything. That would confirm what the media had been speculating about for weeks. William straightened his tie, a gesture Catherine had seen him make countless times before important events. But his hands trembled slightly, betraying the emotion he was trying so hard to contain. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort as she had done so many times before, but something held her back. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the growing realization that their paths were diverging in ways neither of them had anticipated. The children were already at school, blissfully unaware of the conversation their parents had shared the night before. George, Charlotte, and Louis would need to be told, but that difficult conversation would come later. For now, Catherine was grateful they were spared from witnessing this moment of uncertainty between their parents. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of photographers gathering near the palace gates. The media circus was already beginning, hungry for any glimpse of drama or emotion. Soon, every gesture, every expression would be analyzed and dissected by strangers who thought they understood the complexities of royal marriage. Catherine walked to the window and gazed out at the gardens she had grown to love. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the heaviness in her heart.
Oh.
She remembered planting some of those flowers with William during happier times, their laughter mixing with the sound of gardening tools and birdsong. Now, even those memories felt tainted by the weight of present circumstances. Catherine Williams' voice was softer now, almost hesitant, noting how the morning light highlighted the lines around his eyes. Evidence of the sleepless nights they had both endured recently. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that I never intended for things to become so complicated." She studied his face, searching for the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. He was still there, beneath the layers of royal protocol and public expectation, but he felt increasingly distant. The crown that would one day sit upon his head already seemed to be creating an invisible barrier between them, changing the dynamic of their relationship in ways neither had fully anticipated when they exchanged vows. The silence stretched between them like a physical presence, heavy and uncomfortable. Catherine found herself remembering their first major argument as a married couple, how they had worked through it together, talking until the early hours of the morning until they found their way back to each other. But this felt different. This wasn't about schedules or public appearances or even family obligations. This was about something deeper, something that had been growing between them for months. William moved closer to the window where she stood, close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne, the same one he had worn since their university days. For a moment, the years fell away, and she was transported back to their tiny flat in Anglesey, where they had lived as newlyweds. Those had been some of their happiest times, when William was still serving as a search and rescue pilot, and they could pretend, at least sometimes, that they were just an ordinary couple. "Do you remember?" William said quietly. His eyes focused on the same garden view, when we used to talk about growing old together, about what our lives would look like in 30 years. His voice carried a wistfulness that made Catherine's heart ache. She did remember those conversations, whispered in the dark after long days, when the future seemed bright and uncomplicated. "I remember," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were going to have a house by the sea. You said you'd teach the children to sail and I would have my photography studio." The memory felt both precious and painful now, a reminder of dreams that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve within the constraints of their royal duties. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. It was Thomas, William's longtime aide. Carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who wished he were anywhere else. "Sir, ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some final details that require your attention before the announcement." Catherine watched William's face transform as he slipped back into his professional role. The vulnerability she had glimpsed moments before disappeared behind a mask of royal composure. It was a transformation she had witnessed countless times, but today it felt like watching him slip away from her entirely. They followed Thomas into the blue drawing room, where several advisors were waiting with documents spread across the mahogany table. Catherine recognized most of them, people who had become fixtures in their lives, managing every aspect of their public existence. But despite their familiarity, she felt like an outsider looking in on a world she had never quite learned to navigate with ease. As William bent over the papers, Catherine found herself studying his profile. The strong jaw that had made her heart race when they first met was now set with determination. But she could see the cost of constant public scrutiny in the new lines around his eyes. The boy who had once made her laugh until her sides hurt had been gradually replaced by the future king, weighted down by responsibilities he had never chosen but could never escape. "Catherine." One of the advisors was addressing her, and she realized she had been lost in thought. "We'll need your signature on these documents as well." She approached the table, noting how the others stepped back slightly, maintaining the respectful distance that protocol demanded, but that sometimes made her feel incredibly alone as she signed her name. Catherine thought about all the other documents she had signed over the years, their marriage certificate, birth certificates. For their children, countless official papers that had gradually woven her life into the fabric of the monarchy. Each signature had felt like both a privilege and a surrender, marking another step away from the life she might have lived as simply Kate Middleton. The meeting concluded with scheduling discussions and media strategies, conversations that felt surreal given the emotional weight of what they were actually discussing. Catherine listened with half her attention, the other half focused on William, who seemed to be retreating further into himself with each passing minute. When the advisors finally left, promising to reconvene later that afternoon, Catherine and William found themselves alone again. But the intimacy they had shared earlier seemed to have evaporated, replaced by the formal distance that had become their default mode in recent months. "The children will ask questions," Catherine said, breaking the silence. It was a practical concern, but one that cut to the heart of everything they were facing. How do you explain to 3 young children that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the pressures of royal duty and public expectation? William nodded, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she knew meant he was struggling with difficult emotions. "We'll find a way to help them understand," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew that some things couldn't be easily explained, especially to children who had known only the security of their parents' united front. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, each note seeming to echo the gravity of the moment. Catherine had always loved that clock. It had belonged to Diana, and William had insisted on keeping it in their private quarters. Now its steady ticking felt like a countdown to something irreversible. She walked to the mantelpiece, where their family photographs were displayed. Her fingers traced the silver frame of their wedding picture, remembering the joy on their faces. That April day when the whole world had watched them promise to love each other forever. The woman in that photograph looked so confident, so certain that love could conquer any obstacle. Catherine wondered when that certainty had begun to crack. "I keep thinking about your mother," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. William stiffened, and she immediately regretted bringing up Diana. But the words were already out there, hanging in the air between them like a challenge. "What about her?" William asked, his voice carefully neutral. Catherine knew she was treading on dangerous ground. Diana's memory was sacred to William, but it was also complicated. Wrapped up in his deepest fears about royal marriage and the cost of living in the public eye. "She loved your father," Catherine continued, choosing her words carefully. "Despite everything that came later, despite all the pain, I think she truly loved him at the beginning. But love wasn't enough to protect her from the system, from the expectations, from the loneliness of being royal." William turned away from her, his shoulders tense. "This isn't about my mother, Catherine. It's about us, about the choices we've made and the ones we're making now." But she could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the echo of old wounds that had never fully healed. Catherine thought about the conversations she'd had with Diana's friends over the years. The stories they'd shared about the late princess's struggles with royal life, the isolation, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being trapped in a gilded cage. It all sounded hauntingly familiar. She had promised herself that her story would be different, that she would find a way to maintain her identity while serving the crown, but somewhere along the way, she had lost herself in the endless cycle of official duties and public appearances. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Maria, the children's nanny, looking uncomfortable about intruding on such a private moment. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but Prince George called from school. He's forgotten his history project at home and was wondering if someone could bring it to him." The normalcy of the request was almost jarring. While Catherine and William were grappling with life-changing decisions, their eldest son was worried about a school assignment. It was a reminder that life would continue, that their children would need stability and normalcy regardless of what. Their parents decided, "I'll take it to him," Catherine said quickly. The idea of seeing George, of having a few moments with her son away from the weight of the morning, felt like a lifeline. "It will give me a chance to prepare what we need to tell them." William nodded, understanding immediately. They both knew that this conversation with the children would be one of the most difficult they'd ever have to navigate. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that his parents are considering a separation while maintaining the facade of royal unity for the sake of the institution? As Catherine gathered George's project from his room, she found herself looking around at the space they had created for their children. The walls were covered with their artwork, photos from family holidays, and school certificates, shrined to the normal childhood they had tried so hard to give George. Charlotte and Louis, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their birth, she picked up a drawing Charlotte had made of their family. All 5 of them holding hands in front of what was unmistakably Kensington Palace. The figures were simple stick people, but Charlotte had taken care to draw crowns on William's and George's heads. Even at 7, she understood the weight of succession, the burden that would one day pass from father to son. When Catherine returned to the drawing room, she found William standing exactly where she had left him, staring out at the gardens with an expression of profound sadness. For a moment, she saw not the future king, but the young man she had fallen in love with, vulnerable and uncertain about the path ahead. "William," she said softly, and he turned to face her. The morning light had shifted, casting new shadows across his face, making him look older somehow. "Before I go to the school, before we move forward with any of this, I need to ask you something." He waited, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that reminded her of their early courtship, when every glance felt charged with possibility and promise. "Is there any part of you that believes we can find our way back to each other?" The question hung between them, raw and honest. It was perhaps the most important question she had ever asked him, and she held her breath waiting for his answer. "William." It was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Catherine felt the weight of their entire relationship. All the joy and laughter, all the public triumphs and private struggles, all the moments that had brought them to this crossroads where their Love was being tested by forces beyond their control. William's answer came not in words, but in the way his shoulders sagged. As if the question had finally broken through the walls he had been building around himself for months. He moved toward her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion. In his eyes, the toll that their struggles had taken on him. "Catherine," he said, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "There's a part of me that will always believe in us, but I don't know if that's enough anymore. I don't know if believing is enough when everything else seems to be working against us." She felt tears threatening but fought them back. This wasn't the time for crying, not when they needed clarity more than emotion. "What changed?" she asked. "When did we stop fighting for each other and start fighting against the circumstances?" William ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture that had become more frequent as the pressures of his role increased. "I think it was gradual," he admitted. "So gradual that neither of us noticed until we were already too far apart to easily find our way back. The demands of duty, the constant scrutiny, the way everyone else seems to have an opinion about our marriage, it all became noise that drowned out our actual voices." Catherine thought about the past year, how their conversations had increasingly focused on schedules and obligations rather than dreams and feelings. When had they stopped talking about their hopes and started only discussing their responsibilities? When had their private moments become so scarce that they felt like strangers living in the same house? "The media attention has been particularly brutal lately," she said, remembering the headlines that had dissected every public appearance, every perceived slight or sign of tension between them. "Sometimes I wonder if we're living our actual lives or just performing a version of them for public consumption." William nodded grimly. "Yesterday, I read an article that claimed to know more about my feelings than I do myself. They had quotes from sources close to the palace discussing our private conversations that never actually happened." His frustration was evident, but underneath it, Catherine could hear something else, a kind of defeat that worried her more than anger ever could. The sound of her phone ringing interrupted them. It was George's school, probably wondering about the forgotten project. Catherine answered quickly, assuring them she was on her way, then hung up and looked at William with regret. The timing felt wrong. They were finally talking honestly. And now she had to leave. "Go to him," William said, understanding her dilemma. "George needs his mother right now. We can continue this conversation when you return." But something in his tone suggested he wasn't sure they would be able to pick up these threads again. At the moment of vulnerability might pass and leave. Then once again struggling to connect, Catherine gathered her things, but paused at the door. "William, promise me something. Promise me that whatever we decide, we won't let bitterness poison what we had. Our children deserve to see that their parents once loved each other deeply, even if we can't make it work now." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his eyes the young man who had nervously asked her to marry him on a mountainside in Kenya. "I promise," he said quietly. "Whatever else happens, I won't let our story become a tragedy." The drive to George's school gave Catherine time to think, to process the conversation she and William had just shared. The London streets passed by, in a blur of familiar sights that suddenly felt foreign, as if she were seeing her life from the outside for the first time in years. At the school, George was waiting by the main office, looking younger than his 10 years despite his grown-up concern about the forgotten project. When he saw her, his face lit up with relief and joy, and Catherine felt her heart clench. How could she and William even consider putting their children through the pain of separation? "Mummy, thank you for bringing it," George said, hugging her tightly. "I was worried Mr. Henderson would think I didn't care about the assignment." His innocence was both heartbreaking and precious, a reminder of what they were all fighting to protect. "Of course, darling," Catherine said, smoothing his hair. "Your education is important, and I'll always be here when you need me." The words felt like a vow, not just to her son, but to herself. Whatever happened between her and William, she would not let their children pay the price for their inability to navigate the complexities of royal marriage. As she drove back to Kensington Palace, Catherine found herself taking a different route, one that passed by some of the places that had been significant in her relationship with William. The restaurant where they had their first official date. The park where they used to walk when they were just university students trying to figure out their future together. Each location held memories that felt both precious and painful now. She wondered if love could survive the weight of expectation. If two people could find their way back to each other after losing themselves in the roles they were expected to play. By the time she returned to the palace, Catherine had made a decision. She wasn't ready to give up on their marriage without one final attempt to break through the walls that had grown between them. Whatever it took, whatever conversations they needed to have, she was willing to fight for the connection they had once shared. When Catherine returned to the palace, she found William in his father's old study, staring at a photograph of his grandparents. The late Queen and Prince Philip smiled back from the frame, their hands intertwined despite the formal pose. They had weathered their own storms, their own moments of doubt and difficulty, yet they had remained together for over 70 years. "They made it look so easy," William said, without turning around, as if he had sensed her presence. "But I wonder, now, if it was ever easy, or if they just learned to hide the struggle better than we have." Catherine approached slowly, studying the photograph over his shoulder. She had met the Queen many times, had grown to love and respect her. But she had never asked about the personal cost of royal marriage. Perhaps that had been a mistake. Perhaps understanding the struggles of previous generations could have helped them navigate their own. "Your grandmother once told me that marriage was like tending a garden," Catherine said, remembering a private conversation from years earlier. She said it required daily attention, constant care, and the willingness to weather seasons when nothing seemed to bloom. I think I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way. William finally turned to face her, and she was surprised to see that his eyes were redrimmed, as if he had been crying. The sight broke something open in her chest, a rushing feeling of love and protectiveness that reminded her why she had fallen for him in the first place. "Catherine, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "While you were gone, I spoke with my father. I asked him how he knew when his marriage to my mother was truly over, when there was no path back to happiness." Catherine felt her breath catch. The question represented a crossing of sorts, an acknowledgement that they were seriously considering ending their marriage rather than fighting to save it. But she forced herself to listen, to hear what King Charles had told his son about the end of love. He said that the moment he knew it was over was when they stopped seeing each other as allies and started seeing each other as obstacles to their own happiness. When every conversation became a negotiation instead of a connection. William paused, studying her face. "I don't want that to be us, Catherine. I don't want to reach the point where we can't even remember why we loved each other." The honesty in his words was both devastating and hopeful. He was admitting that they weren't at that point yet, that somewhere beneath all the stress and responsibility and public pressure, the foundation of their love still existed. "Then don't let us get there," Catherine said, stepping closer to him. "William, I came back from seeing George with something to say, and I need you to hear me completely before you respond." He nodded, giving her his full attention in a way that felt rare and precious these days. "I think we've been approaching this all wrong," she continued. "We've been trying to fix our marriage by managing the external pressures, the media, the royal duties, the public expectations. But those things aren't what's broken. What's broken is that we stopped prioritizing each other. We stopped being partners and became two people trying to survive the same difficult circumstances." William was quiet, but she could see him processing her words, considering their truth. "I'm not naive enough to think that love conquers all," Catherine went on. "I know that being royal means making sacrifices that other couples don't have to make. But I also know that the man I married was worth fighting for, and I think I still am too. The question is whether we're willing to do the work to find each other again." The silence that followed felt different from the uncomfortable distance that had characterized their morning. This felt like possibility, like the moment before a decision that could change everything. "What kind of work?" William asked finally, and Catherine felt a flutter of hope at the question. He wasn't dismissing her proposal. He was asking for specifics. "Therapy," she said simply. "Real, honest couples counseling with someone who understands the unique pressures we face, but won't let us hide behind them. Time together without phones or schedules or other people. A commitment to rebuilding our friendship before we worry about anything else." William moved to the window, looking out at the same garden view that had drawn their attention earlier. But now the afternoon light was different, softer somehow, and Catherine chose to take that as a sign. There would have to be ground rules, he said slowly. No advisors in our personal conversations. No scheduled romance or mandatory date nights. And we'd have to accept that it might not work, that we might discover we've grown too far apart. To bridge the gap, Catherine felt tears of relief beginning to form. He wasn't saying yes, but he wasn't saying no either. He was negotiating, which meant he was considering the possibility of fighting for their marriage instead of simply ending it. I can accept those conditions, she said, but I have one of my own. We have to be honest about everything, our fears, our resentments, our disappointments. No more pretending that royal protocol is more important than emotional honesty. William turned back to her, and for the first time all day, she saw something that looked like hope in his expression. When would we start? He asked. The question hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and risk in equal measure. The afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long golden rays across the study floor. Catherine and William stood facing each other in that warm light. And she realized that this moment, this choice between giving up and trying, again would be one she remembered for the rest of her life, regardless of how things turned out. We could start today, she said softly. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with something simple. We could have dinner together tonight, just the two of us, and talk about something other than duty or schedules or public appearances. We could try to remember what it feels like to just be Catherine and William, instead of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. William's expression softened, and she saw a hint of the smile that had first captured her heart all those years ago at university. I'd like that, he said, though I should warn you, I'm not sure I remember how to have a normal conversation anymore. I think I've forgotten how to talk about anything that isn't related to royal obligations. Catherine laughed, and the sound surprised them both. It had been so long since they had shared genuine laughter that it felt almost foreign. Then we'll have to relearn together, she said. We can start with the basics, favorite books, movies we want to see, places we'd like to visit if we weren't who we are. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway reminded them that their private moment couldn't last indefinitely. Soon, the demands of their public roles would reassert themselves, and they would have to return to being the royal couple that everyone expected them to be, who had loved each other once and were hoping they could learn to do so again. Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic about the interruption. Sir, ma'am, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there are several urgent matters that require your attention. The press office is asking about the statement, and there are some scheduling conflicts for next week's engagements. Catherine saw William's jaw tighten, the old familiar stress returning to his features. For a moment, she worried that the fragile understanding they had just reached would crumble under the weight of their responsibilities. But then William did something that surprised her. Thomas, he said firmly, please tell the press office that there will be no statement today. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge will be taking the evening off from all official duties. Any urgent matters can wait until tomorrow morning. Thomas looked startled. It was unlike either of them to postpone royal business without a compelling trade reason, but he simply nodded and said, Of course, sir. I'll handle the arrangements. After Thomas left, Catherine looked at William with newfound respect. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but it felt significant. He had chosen their conversation, their tentative reconciliation, over the endless demands of royal duty. It was exactly the kind of prioritization she had been hoping for. That was brave, she said, and meant it. Choosing us over the schedule, it's harder than it sounds. William moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the determination in his eyes. Catherine, I realized something while you were gone this morning. I've been so focused on being the perfect future king that I forgot how to be a good husband. I lost sight of what really matters. She felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of hope rather than sadness. We both lost sight of things, she admitted. I got so caught up in trying to be the perfect royal wife that I stopped being myself. And if I'm not myself, how can I expect you to love me? They were standing very close now, closer than they had been in months. Catherine could feel the familiar pull of attraction, the chemistry that had drawn them together in the first place. But more than that, she could feel the deeper connection. Friendship, partnership, the shared understanding that came from years of facing the world together. "So, what happens now?" William asked. "How do we begin again?" Catherine smiled, reaching out to take his hand for the first time in longer than she cared to remember. His fingers intertwined with hers automatically, muscle memory from years of holding hands at public events. But this felt different. This felt chosen rather than performed. "Now we have dinner," she said simply. "We light some candles, we open a bottle of wine, and we talk. We tell each other about our dreams and fears and the things we've been too afraid to say. We remember why we chose each other in the first place." William lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles in a gesture that was both formal and intimate. "And tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow we wake up and choose each other again," Catherine replied. "And the day after that, and the day after that?" "We do the work, William. We fight for this, for us, for our family. Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it." As they walked toward the door together, leaving behind the study where they had almost said goodbye forever, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope for their future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees that their love would be strong enough to overcome all the obstacles they faced, but they were willing to try, and sometimes, she reflected, that willingness was where love truly began. The palace corridors that had felt cold, institutional that morning, now seemed warm and welcoming, filled with the possibility of new beginnings. And as they made their way to the private dining room where they would share their first real conversation in far too long, Catherine allowed herself to believe that their story wasn't ending, it was just beginning a new chapter.